Okay, welcome you guys. We're going to start chapter 26 here, and this is the US's road to World War II. What we're going to look at in chapter 26, excuse me, in chapter 26 is the 2 decades leading up to World War II. So, in other words, what went on for those 20 years um, that led the United States into its involvement in World War II. So, uh, chapter 24 was the Roaring Twenties. Okay, chapter 25 was the Great Depression, which was basically the 30s. So now we're going to combine the two and look at political and social events that led us to entering World War II. Okay. It's important to note that the majority of the United States were what we called isolationists at the time. Okay, vocabulary word there. To be isolated means off by yourself. Um, at the same time, the United States wanted to be on the global scene. They wanted trade to continue. They wanted profits. And this was called independent internationalism. Okay, active globally but independent. Main goal here was to avoid war. Okay, we're right off the heels of World War One. We don't want another one. Let's see here. One of the things that was a concern for President FDR and others in the government was German and Japanese expansion. We saw this last year in world history, and we called it the rise of fascism. Okay, so Germany and Japan were both increasing the size of their empire. What they were doing was trying to become self sufficient. In other words, they didn't want to have to rely on anybody. This is a new vocabulary word called autarky. That's economic independence. Okay, we know Japan is an island. They only have so many resources. If they need more, they're going to have to go out and take it, which is uh, basically building empire. Okay, autarky. Searching for peace and order in the 1920s. World War I devastates Europe. World War I devastates the world. We have a League of Nations, which was created to avoid war, but it's weak. Okay, it's extremely weak. There will be no permanent peace unless economic satisfactions are enjoyed. In other words, if you can't keep people happy, if people do not have their needs met, you will have war. We have all sorts of different groups trying to keep the peace. Women's group, Jane Addams there, the Settlement House. The peace groups differ on how to prevent war. And we have, okay, a significance, Washington Naval Conference 1921-22. This is right off the end of World War, in which submarines were so destructive. The Washington Naval Conference, the U.S. attempts to slow the arms race and stabilize Asia. Why? Because they feared Japan. We just said on the previous slide that Japan was expanding, and it was a concern that Japan would get larger militarily than the U.S. and British navies. This leads to the five-power treaty. Five countries. They get together and sign a few agreements limiting the size of their navy. Again, going back to this thought of preventing war. Okay, no construction of capital ships. Capital ships would be battleships and aircraft carriers. Okay. They sign a couple of other treaties, the Nine Power Treaty, that's 9 countries. But again, all these treaties are influenced, all these treaties have a goal of trade and preventing war. Okay? The Nine Power Treaty affirms an open door policy in China, so all European countries and the US, including Japan, can get a peace. The Four Power Treaty is between US, Great Britain, Japan, and France. And that basically says, hey, we'll respect each other's Pacific possessions. So for the United States, that would be the Philippines. Okay. Great Britain was in uh, Hong Kong, and Japan was in Manchuria, China, etc. Note that none of them limited submarines, though. Okay, none of them limited destroyers or cruisers. Those are all ships of war. Their only source, their excuse me, their only purpose is war. This is an important one. The 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact basically outlaws war. How do we prevent war? Well, we outlaw it. Okay, does it really make sense? No. I mean, what are you going to do? Go to war to prevent war? So again, a lot of these treaties were for peace of mind, but they weren't really accomplishing a lot. Okay, economic and cultural expansion. The United States after World War One is top dog economically, politically, militarily, and we start shipping our way of life and our goods off. Okay, we figure that if we export our goods and expand, we'll create a more stable world, democracy, our goods, our culture, etc. U.S. products, Hollywood movies, they saturate the globe. We're looked at as the leaders. This is referred to as Americanization. A couple of agreements here that you can take a look at. We have the creation of these large corporations, these giants, ITT, which you know now as AT&T. Okay, that was the telegraph. RCA, AP, Pan American was the first airlines, etc., etc. Shipping America off to the world. This graph you should take a look at in your text basically shows the inverse relationship between tariffs and trade. So what you know, the years are across the bottom. So if we look through Depression era all the way to the United States, remember we said World War II will ultimately bring us out of the Depression, right? That production. So if you look at tariffs, the purple, when tariffs are low, trade is high. When tariffs are high, trade is low. Okay, because what ends up happening is one country slaps a high tariff on another country, and then that country responds by increasing tariff of its own and creates a tariff war. Okay, we looked at this. I'm going to buzz through this. We looked at this last year. This is post World War One and rebuilding Germany after the war, and in Europe for that matter. Let's not forget that the Allies, that's Great Britain and France, owe the United States close to $10 billion. They owe us. And then Germany, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, were ordered to pay 33 billion in reparations. Okay, this creates a triangular effect, basically with the Dawes Plan. The United States comes in and bails out Germany. We give loans and money to Germany so they can rebuild their economy. Okay, the U.S. is here. We give money and loans to Germany. Then Germany rebuilds its economy and sends money to Great Britain and France in the form of reparations, and then Great Britain and France then pay us back the 10 billion that they owe us. Okay, it was a fragile existence. The Great Depression brings a massive decrease in trade. The United States tries to respond and protect its U.S. goods. Remember, the Depression started with us. We start to protect our goods with tariffs. Well, what happens? We slap tariffs on, then Great Britain slaps tariffs on, Germany slaps tariffs on, and we get into what's called a tariff war. During the Great Depression, global trade went down by 40%. That's not good for anybody. Tariff wars kill international trade. And therefore, like we were talking about at the beginning, if people are unhappy, you have more chance of war. We do a few things to try and counteract this reciprocal trade agreement. Basically gives a most favored nation principle. If you're one of the cool kids, if you're one of ours, and you agree to play nicely with trade, we will reduce the tariffs and trade with you only. The U.S. recognition of the Soviet Union, we had not recognized them. Don't forget that the Russian Revolution had begun in 1917. Stalin had consolidated his power by 1928-ish, but the United States refused to recognize the Soviet Union as a country. They hadn't existed. Well, then a few things change, and FDR decides to recognize them. Number one, they began to buy a lot of our farm equipment. There's trade. Number two, Japan had started creeping up in here, and Japan had started creeping up in here. He hoped that if the USSR and the US were a little bit more friendly, it would prevent Japanese aggression. Latin America, don't forget with the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, the United States had declared Latin America as basically our sphere of influence, okay? And we are going to control it economically. Let's see here. U.S. dominance, economic, military, political grows after 1920. I got a map on the next page. U.S. investments, $3.5 billion. Latin Americans suffer at this uh, economic imperialism. FDR initiates what's called the good neighbor policy. Basically, he's trying to make Latin Americans more happy with us because they were suffering. They weren't happy with U.S. intervention. The good neighbor policy makes it less blatant. So basically, we're still dominating Latin America, but it's covert, it's undercover, it's not as much out in the open. We start to help out with some of their needs, like fighting disease and things like that. All right, here's that map. I'll let you guys look at that yourself. But every single one of these bubbles is a place where the United States intervened in Latin America. On this, we're talking about the United States doing some of the shady things that we have discussed. For example, using dictators. Dictators are against democracy. That's right. But if the dictators helped us with trade and helped us keep our sphere of influence, then we were willing to use them. An example would be propping up Batista in Cuba in 1934. Mexico is our biggest challenge, as Mexico wants to take control of its own raw materials. The United States had dominated Mexico with control of mines and railroads and telephone and things like that. Back and forth negotiations went on. And basically we said, all right, Mexico, you can control your own land and oil, but you got to pay back U.S. businesses. You have to compensate U.S. businesses for anything that's been repatriated. FDR is able to reduce anti-Americanism without a loss of power and influence. And we go to the course of war in Europe. Okay, 1939, World War II breaks out. The United States is isolationist. We are not in it, and we don't want to be in it. We do our best to stay out, as we'll see in the next few sections here. Okay. I'm going to pick up with this slide on the next segment. Would you please review fascism on your own? Okay, fascism, type of totalitarian control. Similar to communism, but not the same. Okay, good. I'll see you guys next time.